Dear students, welcome to another lecture on modern political philosophy. In this lecture, we will discuss the concept of alienation. The main objectives of this lecture are to know the meaning of alienation, to understand the types of alienation in social sciences, to recognize the relationship between alienation and capitalism, and to comprehend the theory of alienation as given by Karl Marx. Dear students, alienation is one of the most critical concepts in Marxist philosophy. Karl Marx developed the concept of alienation to describe the impact of a capitalist production system on the working class. In this manner, alienation is central to the Marxist critique of capitalism. Marx's primary critique of capitalism is that it is essentially alienating. Let us now look at the question, what is alienation? The concept of alienation identifies a particular kind of psychological or social ill. To understand how alienation works, we need to remember that the process of alienation involves three elements: self, other, and the relationship between them. Alienation generally refers to a problematic separation between a self and other that previously belonged naturally together. Discussions of alienation are largely, but not only, associated with Hegelian and Marxist intellectual traditions. The phenomenon of alienation has a history of its own, staying around since the age of Enlightenment. However, for someone born in the age of capitalism, where capitalist beliefs fill every sphere of human society, it might be challenging to imagine alienation in any other historical context. To avoid this mistake, let us look at the history of alienation before its Marxist theorization. History of alienation before Marx. The term alienation is usually thought to have comparatively modern European origins. The term had emerged in English by the early 15th century with an interesting cluster of meanings. Alienation and its cognates were used to refer to an individual's estrangement from God, legal transfers of ownership rights, and even mental instability. Melvin Seaman identifies 5 alternative meanings of alienation: powerlessness, meaninglessness, normlessness, isolation, and self-estrangement. He derives these meanings from traditional sociological analysis. These meanings can serve only as a rough guide because there can be radically different conceptions of the idea within any of these categories. Recognition of the concept of alienation in Western thought has been vague. Although entries on alienation did not appear in major social science reference books until the 1930s, the idea had existed implicitly or explicitly in classical sociological works of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Perhaps the most famous use of the term was by Karl Marx, who spoke of alienated labor under capitalism. Marxism, however, represents only one stream of thought concerning alienation in modern society. There is another theorization of alienation in sociological theories. Let us look at 2 types of alienation in social sciences. alienation has mainly been described in two ways: economic alienation as articulated by Karl Marx and social alienation as defined by Émile Durkheim. French sociologist Émile Durkheim famously described social alienation in the late 19th century with his idea of anomie in his 1893 book The Division of Labor in Society. He further developed this idea in his 1897 book Suicide, A Study in Sociology. Anomie describes a lack of social norms or the breakdown of social bonds between an individual and his community ties, resulting in the fragmentation of social identity. Recall the three elements involved in the process of alienation: self, in this case the individual; other, the community; and the relation between them, that of social bonding in this example. According to Durkheim, when one is caught in a normless state in society, one has no parameters to hold on to. Due to this, one cannot situate oneself within that society and becomes socially adrift and isolated. Durkheim writes that anomie is expected when the surrounding society has undergone significant changes in its economic fortunes, whether for better or worse, or more generally when there is a considerable discrepancy between the ideological theories and values commonly professing what is practicable in everyday life. Social alienation remains a broad concept used by sociologists to describe the experience of individuals or groups that feel disconnected from their community or society's values, norms, practices, and social relations. Such experiences may arise due to various social structural reasons, including and in addition to economic changes. Let us now discuss Marxist concept of alienation. Alienation had its philosophical birth long before Marx wrote the economic and philosophical manuscripts in 1844. Yet, it is this text that to date provides the best possible account of the process of alienation in a capitalist society. The economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844 is a series of papers written by a young Marx during the period of April and August 1844. They are also referred to as the Paris manuscripts and the 1844 manuscripts. However, these manuscripts were published in 1932, long after the death of Marx. Alienation is an idea which appears in the 1844 manuscripts under the chapter titled Estranged Labor and in Capital, a critique of political economy, published in 1867. Marx developed the idea of alienation out of his study of Hegel. Hegel is the thinker who owns the credit for coining the concept of alienation. According to Erich Fromm, and I quote, "To him, Hegel, history of man was at the same time history of man's alienation," unquote. However, in Hegel's thought, alienation was imagined as a necessary process for self-realization. The term alienation refers to the translation of two German words meaning estrangement and externalization. Estrangement and externalization are sometimes used as synonyms of each other and at other times as parts or stages of the process of alienation. These German terms emerged specifically in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit in 1807. Marx imagines alienation differently from Hegel. For Marx, alienation is a particular historical phenomenon of capitalist society. Alienation means the lack of power, control, and fulfillment experienced by workers in capitalist societies where the means of production are privately owned and controlled. Frank Wiener explains this through alienation as estrangement. To be estranged means that our social nature, which both makes possible and is realized through our free conscious activity, facilitated by our emotional registration, orientation, and activation of such activity, is somehow either not realized or hindered in practice. The mechanism of capitalist production cannot help but increase the feelings of estrangement among and in the individuals operating under it. This is why Marx saw an end of alienation only at the end of the capitalist mode of production itself. Thus, a respite from alienation could only be possible in a communist society. In his theory of alienation, Marx also provides us with his imagination of human beings and his understanding of human nature, or what he calls species being. Alienation fundamentally deals with the question of man in terms of his essence. For Marx, activity defines human essence or spirit. Man is by nature active. Hence, Marx often uses the expression life activity to denote life. The human being is essentially a worker. Marx is working with a picture of human nature where humans are by nature world builders. We seek to externalize our essence by putting it out in the world and creating things following a given end according to laws of beauty and usefulness. In labor, human beings fully develop their talents and express themselves. Hannah Arendt argues that humans are homo faber for Marx. Homo faber is a Latin term which is translated into man the maker. So, human beings are working, laboring, productive and constructive beings. Marx believes that we achieve our human nature through work. However, in the modern historical context, capitalism reconfigures human relationships and human nature itself, leading to a distortion of its naturalness. Erich Fromm talks of alienation as a disease of contemporary man. In other words, alienation can be defined as a loss of humanness, making it a process of dehumanization. Let us now clarify the connection between alienation and capitalism. For Marx, alienation is a product of class society in general and capitalist society in particular. According to him, alienation flows from the relations of production or the social relations of the capitalist mode of production. Marx believes that workers' labor was less alienating in pre-capitalist societies. He claimed this was because the workers had more control over their working conditions, the work was highly skilled, and they would make the whole product from start to finish. As a result, the work was more satisfying. because the workers could see an expression of themselves in what they produced. However, this craftsmanship decreased with the introduction of capitalism and industrial factories in the 19th century. Workers now had less control over their work, were often unskilled, and were very often just part of a mass production line. According to Marx, the economic system itself is what causes alienation. In his analysis of the working class in capitalism, Marx argues that capitalism creates and maintains a pool of unemployed, underemployed, and partially employed labor as a reserve army of labor. Capitalism pushes workers towards a path of absolute impoverishment. When the reserve army of labor is large, the workers' wages can be reduced to even below the subsistence level. In such a state of economic exploitation, the worker struggles to survive. One of the significant critiques of capitalism for Marx is that it is essentially exploitative. Due to the exploitative nature of the capitalist system, the working experience is extremely frustrating and unpleasant for the worker. While capitalist domination is ultimately rooted in the exploitation of labor by capitalists, this relationship is naturalized and expressed as a general confrontation between individuals and society. The inhuman working conditions, low wages, increasing mechanization of work, and severe economic exploitation result in varying experiences of estrangement, separation, isolation, dehumanization, and alienation for workers. According to Marx, there are 4 levels or stages of alienation experienced by a worker under capitalism. Let us discuss them briefly. The first level of alienation, according to Marx, is alienation from the product of labor. The core of alienation is that the product which man produces stands out as an alien. Earlier, the product of labor was seen as a part of the worker's self, a piece of art to be proud of. Today, in contrast to that picture, the product of labor is seen as a commodity meant for sale in the market. Man is nothing more than a producer, a worker. All his other roles get reduced to that of his productive capacities. The object or product of labor stands opposed to labor as an alien thing, as a power independent of the producer. Marx says that workers no longer find a reflection of their own capacities in the objects they create. When life activity takes the form of labor under capitalism, man loses control over his evolution. Under capitalism, the control passes from man to object. The object, after alienation, is turned into a thing. As a result, the realization of labor in the product is replaced by an objectification of labor. In this objectification, there is number 1, loss of the product of labor, and number 2, domination of the product of labor. Erich Fromm explains this beautifully, and I quote, A person is not only little, he is nothing, because he is dominated by the things and circumstances that he himself has created. Modern man is controlled by the products of his own hands. He himself becomes a thing. He is nothing. Unquote. This is described as the process of reification or thingification, where a subject is transformed into an object. In this case, labor and the products of labor are transformed into objects, things, or commodities. In other words, it can be understood as thingification of persons and personification of things. In feudalism, slaves were thingified. In capitalism, labor and its product are thingified. The second level of alienation for Marx is alienation from work or labor process. According to Marx, labor is activity par excellence, in which man realizes his deepest potential, and this gets perverted under capitalism. It turns into something ugly, just a commodity, a thing to sell in the market. The principles of accounting and profit have expanded from economics to human life and are now applied to the worker. The worker has himself become an enterprise of the commodity of labor. Workers are understood and assessed based on their cost and output, and no longer as producers having creative potential. Marx perceived the labor process as directed against the worker, as if it did not belong to him. While the labor process is not physically forced upon workers, it is forced in the sense that it becomes non-voluntary. Marx contrasts the lives of human beings and the lives of workers in terms of human and animal activities like eating, sleeping, and procreating. Under the division of labor, due to the assembly line model, the work process is beyond the worker's control. The assembly line mass production model completely cuts the link between the producer and the product. When the worker does this activity, he does not affirm himself but denies his human nature. This leads to a reversal of human and animal activities in the case of workers and dehumanization of their life activity. Alienated labor reduces humans to the levels of animals. In other words, the worker does not make a product, he makes wages. Wages become the necessary consequence of the alienation of labor. In the absence of alienation, there would be no question of wages. Without wages, labor cannot be externalized and commodified. Wages stabilize this form of labor which is constantly being externalized. Wages can never be fair for Marx. They can never be a proper compensation or replacement of the product of labor. The worker becomes a slave of wages. Hence, Marx has labeled activity in the bourgeois capitalist system as wage slavery. The third level of alienation is alienation from species being. This is the alienation of the worker from his species being. Marx borrows the term species being from the works of Ludwig Feuerbach, who uses it to distinguish between humans and animals. In the German Ideology, written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in 1846 and published in 1932, Marx writes, and I quote, "Yet the productive life is the life of the species. The whole character of a species, its species character, is contained in the character of its life activity, and free conscious activity is man's species character." Unquote. Man transforms nature and in the process evolves and realizes oneself. So, life activity is a progressive transformation of nature. This type of production is free and self-chosen. Conscious life activity distinguished humans from animal life activity. However, in a capitalist society, the life activity between man and nature becomes a mere means of existence, not an articulation of one's life activity. Man is then said to have lost his species being, which is characterized by life activity. The individual is cut off from the wholesomeness of nature, and in this process, the human being loses his worth and value. The feature of an engagement turns into the experience of estrangement, emptiness, and isolation. Erich Fromm brings out this peculiarity as, and I quote, "In the 19th century, one could say God is dead. In the 20th century, one must say that man is dead. Today, this adage rings true: man is dead, long live the thing." Unquote. Marx refers to the fact that under capitalism, human social relations between people are only realized indirectly as relations between things. This is described as commodity fetishism. It is a type of reification where social relations between people are transformed into social relations between objects or commodities. The fetishism of commodities is directly related to the theory of estrangement. The last level of alienation for Marx is alienation from fellow human beings. If the man is alienated from his species being, that means man is also alienated from other men, fellow human beings. If a man has lost control over his act of production, it means that some other man is controlling his activity. In that case, that other man possesses the externalized labor of this man, whose visible forms are either private property or wages. Marx often uses these two terms interchangeably. Logically, if a person's labor does not belong to themselves, it belongs to some other man than the worker. The worker also does not have a share in the profit earned from the sale of goods and has no say in the value or price placed upon what is produced. All of this results in a separation or estrangement between a person's labor activity and their self, spirit, or species being. In addition to the worker's alienation from the capitalist, there is also the alienation of the worker from other workers due to opposing competition among them. In a capitalist economy, the workers end up competing with each other for jobs, wages, and other economic benefits. If workers do not want to starve, they feel forced to engage in the labor process under capitalism at even less than the minimum wage rate. Due to this competition and the extreme poverty of workers, wages come down as workers are ready to work at lesser wages. This competition helps the capitalists in bringing down wages and maximizing their profit. Workers become self-interested individuals. They treat each other as objects or means for the end of profit maximization. They no longer behave as social individuals involved in collective goals. This is why workers cannot come together under revolutionary class consciousness. The alienation from fellow human beings results in the creation of false consciousness. The workers fail to see how the capitalists exploit them, which becomes the primary reason for the delay in the revolution to overthrow capitalism. To conclude, alienation for Marx is the process of objectifying and commodifying labor and the working class and their appropriation by capitalists. The starting point is universal saleability, where everything becomes a commodity for sale in the market. With the universalization of saleability, everything becomes alienable. In his 1904 book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Max Weber described the most fateful force in our modern life, namely an economic order in which all human activities, aims and aspirations are subordinated to the accumulation of capital. Generally speaking, the Marxist theory of alienation focuses on critiquing a society built on the logic of capital accumulation. Perhaps no one would disagree that work gives human beings their dignity. As long as human beings are denied their freedom to work on their terms and conditions, alienation will remain a significant reality of human existence and a key concept in modern political philosophy. As Seaman pointed out, and I quote, "Investigations of the unattached, the marginal, the obsessive, the normless, and the isolated individual all testify to the central place occupied by the hypothesis of alienation in contemporary social science." Unquote. So dear students, I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Thank you.